We are here today to demonstrate that not only the immorality of slavery, but also the lesser-known effects of slavery on the South itself. In the Declaration of Independence, our forefathers stated that all men are created equal, yet 3 million people work as slaves in this country, forced with no rights and terrible conditions. These slaves receive little sleep as they are forced to work long hours, and little food as slave owners want to maximize profits. They live in fear as they are subject to harsh and cruel punishments like whippings for seemingly frivolous reasons. Families are broken up. Frederick Douglass recounts how he was separated from his mother when he was still an infant. There is no hope for freedom after years of servitude. Furthermore, slavery is unnecessary. Even after using slave labor for decades, the South is still behind the North economically. The agricultural interests in the North are better than those in the South, and the North isn't actually that reliant on the goods of the South. Most of the food produced in the United States of America comes from the North, especially since cotton is prevalent in the South. Most plantations of slaves focus on cash crops to make more money. Slavery also affects white men poorly. Since only the aristocrats can afford slaves to work on their plantations, slavery widens the gap between the wealthy and the poor. The common white Southerner cannot compete with slaves in finding employment, and they cannot hope to rise to the same social standards as the plantation owners.
Our nation was built on the backs of slaves, working in the fields and fueling our economy. We are here today to present how slavery is beneficial, because our country's success is based upon the proficiency and products it provides. This system has proved sufficient for all work, from picking cotton in the fields to completing household chores in order to provide owners with more time. With the labor done by slaves in the South, the North would have never had the growth and opportunities that they were provided with, because they would not have access to quality clothing or a steady food source in order to have growth. The North would have failed without the help of slave labor.
You may have concerns about the slaves' conditions and tasks. However, they do not mind because they have a smaller mental capacity, which is perfect for the type of work they perform. Slavery gives these people a chance to contribute to America's economy, since they don't have much else to bring to the table because of their lack of knowledge and talent.
How can we possibly end such a system that has been working so well for so long?
The Greeks and the Romans had slavery. How could they have constructed such complex, admirable societies without the hard work of their trusty slaves?
Even Abraham himself had his own slaves. How can we reject the ways of our ancestors that got us where we are today? Even our American heroes, such as Jefferson, were slave owners themselves.
The South is not the only provider of the food that we've come to enjoy today. In fact, it's debatable whether or not America's food source is solely reliant on the South, one of the main points our opponents will insist upon. The reality is that the North is self-reliant with the amount of the country's wheat coming from the North, which further exemplifies this notion. Even with the slaves, the North is still able to compete with the South for the most percentage of wheat exported and imported in America. On top of this, slave owners support a frightening combination of unpatriotic and unconstitutional ideals if you just look at the implications that surround slavery. Our forefathers founded this nation upon beliefs that every man has a right to freedom, that every man has the right to privacy, and threats to a man's free will has consequences. Yet slave owners removed the freedom of a man by placing ownership on them and treating them in ways that suppress their natural rights and defy God's own amendments, by inflicting them with both cruel and unusual punishment. However, not every man in the South can even afford to own the slaves, which adds another complexity to their social structure. In all reality, the majority of the slaves in the South are owned by a handful of families, and the number of slaves transmits into the amount of power each individual owns. A white man without slaves is even lower in social standing than the slaves. However, not every man in the South can even afford to own slaves, which adds another complexity to their social structure. In all reality, the majority of the slaves in the South are owned by a handful of families, and the number of slaves translates into the amount of power each individual owns. A white man without slaves is even lower in social standing than the slaves. With all the job opportunities filled by slaves who require no pay, they remain unemployed without even the bonus of housing and food, which ends perpetuating the poverty of the entire strat. Even with this lack of employment, the whites are still treated better, however, and the slaves who are being subjected to unfair beatings. The rich 1% of the South is both admitting themselves to eternal damnation and presses their fellow countrymen, all the while contributing little to the good of the nation. And Jefferson loved the slave and ended up continuing his family life through the slave, which means that if our opponents insist that slaves have even lower intelligence than us, that Jefferson was taking advantage of this girl, which is like the same as, let's say, pedophilia. And of course, the Roman Greek empires are great, and they built themselves very high, and we take many of our notions from them today. They all fell. And mainly because their slaves became, let's say, unhappy and caused some uprisings, and let's just say, damned the entire nation to fall.
Although you may believe the Constitution supports the freedom of slaves, you need to consider the forefathers who wrote it. When the Constitution was written, slaves were not even considered because they were not seen as true human beings. To the forefathers who founded our country, slaves were nothing more than another piece of property to provide labor to their owners. Our nation's father, George Washington himself, became a slave owner at the young age of 11. Abolition is an insult in the name of George Washington and our founding fathers, and outright sacrilegious. Abolitionists are spitting on the name of the Lord. How can you call yourselves Christian when you challenge the fundamental values of the Bible?
Slavery should not be frowned upon because the system is really not as corrupt as it seems if you look from the right perspective. Why should owners of slaves be looked down upon for buying and selling slaves? Because they are considered no more than another piece of property. You could accuse slaveholders of breaking a family apart, but if they are not even considered people, what is the difference between that and taking a calf from a cow? Contrary to what you may think, there is some mercy shown to the slaves. They are provided with some sort of food and shelter, as well as a law preventing mother from being separated from her child until the child reaches a certain age. Our opponents may bring up that the North is self-reliant, but I must ask, how did they achieve that standard? The North achieved independence because they had the foundation of crops and necessary materials from the South in order to develop factories and an industrialized society, which creates the illusion of their so-called complete independence. All of the materials provided for the North to fuel their success were a product of slave labor in the South. The abolitionists must also consider the aftermath of getting rid of slavery and possible consequences it may bring about.
Let's say we do free the slaves. What do you expect to happen once they're freed? Do you really believe they will be able to assimilate into our society?
Once they are freed, they will be left with nothing, no means to acquire food, water, or any other basic needs provided by their previous owners. Surely no business will hire them. They will have no shelter to stay in, and their children will starve to death.
Why abolish slavery when all it will do is break our economy and break both black and white lives?
Without slaves, the agricultural world would fall apart because there is not enough people willing to perform the labor required to keep America's economy afloat.
Evidence shows that the peculiar institution is both unconstitutional and unnecessary. Free men in the North can handle themselves and they have integrated themselves into society, seeing as they have jobs and families of their own. We treat them like normal people and they have the opportunities as one of us because guess what? They are normal people. They can handle themselves. Given them the chance, they will advocate for their freedom. And even if you don't give them the chance, if they're still trapped as slaves in the South, they still will fight for their freedom. I mean, they sacrifice their lives every day just trying to escape to the North through Underground Railroad and songs telling how to get to the North. An example, Frederick Douglass is a free man in the North who has gone from slavery to freedom and has advocated for free rights ever since.
Other countries, including Britain, France, and Mexico have already taken the steps in abolishing slavery. The United States needs to do so as well. We import many goods from these countries, and these countries are largely successful without slaves. We already grow most of our own wheat and food crops. We don't need slavery.
Time has shown how slavery has been successful in holding up our economy. And in conclusion, we should maintain this effective and proficient system. Our forefathers said nothing about slavery being unconstitutional. So as long as we keep looking from their perspective, the perspective of our proud founders, we can see slavery as a benefit to society rather than a burden. If slaves are not considered to be people, they cannot be expected to assimilate into society. So in turn, we are actually doing them a favor by keeping the slavery system alive.
Although goods can be imported, slavery allows us to independently produce our own goods rather than having to rely on other countries with higher prices. Keeping slaves keeps the price down and removes the importation tax of agriculture from our economy. So if the other countries were to abandon us, slaves would still be here to keep our country going. Slaves are what fuel our economy.
In America.